Okay. People are still coming in, so let me just wait for a little bit more. Okay. Seconds. Okay, welcome everybody. We are here today to see a book presentation. We have with us three very well-known scholars in the field of higher education, practitioners as well. We're going to have a quite interesting seminar about the design and implementation of academic excellence initiatives. Everybody is trying to be excellent. Everybody is trying to be successful. Probably we're going to have some discussions about what excellent or successful really means. That is always something to be considered. And from what I understand, we're going to have here the discussion of the main findings of 9 European and Asian countries concerning these initiatives. And we will see how these initiatives were successful or not, what challenges did they face, and what were the impacts or consequences that came out of their implementation. So having said this, and it's a very brief introduction, I don't think I need really to present the speakers. They're extremely renowned, well-known in the field of higher education and in a broader field of education as well. I will give the floor then to Philip Altbach, Maria Yudkevich, and Jamil Salmi. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you in Asia. I think it's particularly relevant that we are having this webinar in an Asian context because 4 of the countries that we cover in the book are Asian countries: China, South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. Mainly China has probably invested more money and attention, I would say, and time into excellence initiatives than all of the other countries in our study, the 9 countries combined. So it's particularly interesting that we are in an Asian context here. What we would like to do, as Hugo pointed out, is to provide you with some discussion of why we did this, what it all means, what we discovered from some of the case study countries, and perhaps most important, from our colleague Jamil, what it teaches us about higher education broadly stated. So I would like to begin, and we will each speak for about 15 minutes or maybe a little less, and provide you ample time for discussion, not just questions, I hope, but also some reactions from some of you. So why study academic excellence initiatives? We thought that it would be important to look at some cases of countries that invested significant amounts of money with significant planning and a desire to get ahead. I'll cover that in just a moment, in higher education. And that number of countries is relatively small. We don't know exactly the total number, I think, but it's maybe 15 or 18 all around the world. AEIs are aimed at the elite sector of higher education. None of them are aimed at, consciously anyway, improving the entire system, although many, we found, have had the result of an impact on the broader higher education system as well. So we chose these case studies. It's important to understand that none of them are in the Anglophone world. And by the way, none of them in Africa or in Latin America that we have found. They are all European and Asian, and the large amount of money, mainly from China, has come from Asian sources. So what are the questions that we asked? We asked a number. How does the idea of excellence vary across systems? And we found that the definitions and goals of AEIs in our different case study countries varied tremendously, quite a lot. And we think that's rather important. Is there a recipe for success that can be broadly applied? Dr. Salmi will give us that answer when he speaks. And of course, he's an expert on world-class universities and knows everything about such recipes. And we are expecting to receive a Nobel Prize pretty soon for the broader results which we have found from our studies. So that will make our audience stay till the end of this discussion. What are the general consequences for specific universities and systems as a result of AEIs? And I think we were a little bit surprised that the results in some cases, maybe in many cases, went beyond the specific institutions that actually received funding for the AEIs. Can one claim that the AEIs have had a significant impact on the global standing of national university systems? In a few cases, yes. Certainly in China, that's the case. And in other cases, well, we don't know. We'll look at how that's worked out. And finally, as a question, are the AEIs, is the concept of AEIs a good strategy for higher education systems around the world? In other words, should other countries adopt it? Here are a few observations, and they're just observations, and they will be more discussed by my colleagues in a few minutes. Without any question, the global rankings, and all three of us are rather critical of the global rankings, were influential in the thinking of the different countries. In some cases, the dominant thinking, as in the Russian case, about entering into an AEI. So the rankings were of great importance in concentrating the minds of higher education planners. A few of the countries instilled system thinking and competition into their higher education systems, I think in part anyway, as a result of their participation in the academic excellence initiatives. I think it probably can be generalized, and I would be interested in hearing my colleagues comment on this, that most of the countries in our case studies and institutions moved in a more kind of Anglo-American direction in their higher education institutions, at least in the AEI participating institutions, in a few cases, maybe in the whole system, as a result of their participation. I'm not sure if I actually agree with what I just said, but it's an interesting thing to think about. AEIs, of course, function in the context of massification and also in the context of the global knowledge economy and the importance of research. And as I pointed out, they are aimed at only the top end of complex academic systems. They recognize in all of the cases that these systems have become differentiated over time. And of course, as I've said several times, these AEIs are aimed at the top of the system. Research in some of the countries was placed more in universities than and research institutions than in others. And keep in mind that a few of our case study countries, Russia and China particularly, have traditions of concentrating research in freestanding research institutions as part of academies of science. And one of the goals of AEIs in countries with such scientific systems, Germany to some extent also has that, was to move research into the universities and particularly to better integrate the Academy of Science institutions into the broader ecosphere of scientific research and higher education. Globalization, of course, was an underpinning of these higher education systems and an understanding that the particular countries were in a competitive arrangement with the rest of the world's universities and wanting to make sure that their institutions and particularly their scientific productivity would improve for their participation in globalization and global science. An interesting aspect in some of the countries was the emphasis on the use of English, both for teaching and especially for research. And I can mention one case that I was personally involved with, and that's the Russian case where I had the honor to be a member of the 5100 commission that started and guided the academic excellence initiative in Russia. And it's interesting that the Russians included some international members on their policy committee, and that the workings of the commission were all in English. And I was surprised and of course very helpful to me as a non-Russian speaker that that was the case. I think several of our other case studies had similar arrangements. Academic excellence initiatives, of course, are expensive, in some cases very expensive. In other cases, we found, I think, surprisingly not expensive. I mean, yes, a lot of money was invested by governments, but in Taiwan, for example, and in Denmark, the amounts of money that were expended, even for relatively small countries, was not that great, and my colleagues can comment on that. I think it's likely that in the China case, $100 billion was spent over the about 20 years of the several excellence initiatives in China, mainly 911 and the two big ones. And that amount of money is more than all of the other excellence initiatives combined. And of course, China had very significant success in ensuring that a number of their universities joined the global rankings in fairly high points in those rankings. I think I'll stop there. We should, of course, discuss how successful these initiatives were. And I think all of us would agree that they were to some extent successful. In a few cases, I would point out maybe Japan as the most important one, modest success. In some cases, changing goals and procedures along the way did not help. So there are lessons that can be learned from the case studies. And finally, I would recommend that you read the book, which is available to you, and through the policies of the MIT Press, our publisher has made it available open access to anyone who wants to have it for free. So with that, let me turn over the floor to Maria, who will discuss some of the cases. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you, Professor Horta, for inviting us for this seminar. I will probably start with explaining a little bit why such a title, Academic Star Wars. Why stars? Stars is because stars about shining and admiration, but it's also about visibility and light. And sometimes this light is too bright to see what's really going on there in the stars. And sometimes it's delayed light. So what we see as a light from stars is something that happened some periods ago. And that's what we also see in our cases. So we finished our book exactly 2 years ago, and some things are already history, but at the same time, it would be good that we have them described, because it's allowed us to see how many things in higher education systems are embedded in social, economic, and political contexts. So there are 25,000 universities in the world, and just about 1,200 of them are research intensive, and really small, tiny part participate in academic initiatives. So why care about them and why to write the whole book about them? We believe it's a major phenomenon. First, because it changes their global landscape, and those changes go far beyond participating institutions, and we have a lot of empirical evidence that demonstrates it gives start to discussions about funding models for academic excellence, sustainability, role of academic freedom and their constraints, and dominance or non-dominance of one model of research university all over the world. We have 9 countries in our case studies. Those are very different countries with very different systems in terms of many basic characteristics. For example, we have Malaysia in our book, and the first university in Malaysia was founded in 1949, but in the same time we have Germany that has a university history which goes far back in the history. The number of universities is also different. For example, in Denmark, there's as little as 8 public universities in the country, while in China there are over 3,000 institutions all over the country. And of course, the impact of their programs on the systems is also different. For example, in Taiwan and China is could be considered to be large, while in Denmark is pretty little. So programs are also different, and they're different to start with a rationale for start. They're not homogeneous in terms of goals and rationale behind them. And those initiatives, those programs that started before the emergence of global league tables, namely, for example, China in 1995 or South Korea in 1999, they had more of a, I would say, endogenous character. They reflected more a long-term national strategic concern about academic development, and the idea that universities may be key driver for this development. While at the second wave of programs, which happened at a time when the concept of world-class universities started to gain capacity as a strategy for development to compete in the global higher education scene through the creation of advanced academic research knowledge. So the second wave of initiatives was induced by external considerations more, which linked to perceived competitive disadvantages of national institutions in comparison to the performance of top institutions in UK and US. So some programs, especially from the second wave, they mention rankings explicitly as a part of their mission or even name. For example, Russian case 5 top 100 is not unique in completely mentioning rankings as aims and the name of the program. For example, in Japan, Prime Minister declared in 2013 his policy to have at least 10 Japanese universities ranked in top 100 in the world by 2023 as a symbolic indicator of the recovery of Japan's economy and society. Quite similarly, in France, initiatives were very much a reaction to the lack of visibility of French research in the international rankings. Even in Germany, academic excellence initiatives are quite often associated with what is called Shanghai shock, which is linked to the fact that no German university was represented in top 50 world-class universities either in Shanghai ranking 2003 or in TG ranking 2004. That is what it's called kind of shock. In the same time, the idea of global competitiveness sometimes give floor to more egalitarian approach on later stages of the program, as Phil also mentioned. So the idea of the program changed over time, and that's definitely the cases, for example, of Taiwan and Russia. So internationalization. Internationalization is considered the key element of all programs, and the design often assumes that there is a direct push towards international cooperation, global visibility and mobility, and the program provides direct incentives for both institutions and individuals. In some countries, of course, for example, Japan may be an example of that, into the challenge due to language, cultural traditions, or some other barriers. And since the progress in internationalization is often measured by clear quantitative indicator, such as number of joint articles or proportion of foreign academics and students in the faculty or students body, it gives rise to some mimicry and some adjustments. For example, in Korea, due to limited financial resources, most universities focused more on internationalization at home and their short-term overseas experience for graduate students and faculty rather than real international cooperation. So specifically, for example, they used indicators of internationalization, such a proportion of courses, programs, or even dissertations in English, or short-term courses taught by foreign scholars, rather than more integrative indicators. Similar adjustment techniques were, for example, used in 5 top 100 Russian participating universities as well. Also, indicators were set by government. And governments, of course, play the key major role in funding, design, monitoring, and implementations of all initiatives all over the world. As a Danish government put that in one of the decree in 2006, it is quite a straightforward statement. I would quote that universities that are doing well should be rewarded, and poor quality should have consequences. And of course, such a direct government involvement raises a lot of concerns in most academic excellence initiatives. And for example, Taiwanese case shows that such a huge involvement of the government is likely to dilute social trust and also raise anxiety in the university community. And it reinforces a situation in which the definition of excellence is translated into simple indicators such as position and rankings, etc. And Malaysia, Japan, and Russia are clear examples of such a top-down approach to program implementation. But in the same time, with the government playing the key role in most initiatives, what we don't see the increase of involvement of the industry into the picture, and therefore we don't see the rates of sustainability of this kind of model. So universities are still very much dependent of the government and government money and what government wants them to do. And of course, that's raised a lot of concerns here. And to conclude, I would also mention that, and I hope that Jamil will talk about that more, is that implementation of those initiatives all over the world, including Asian countries, reveal the tension between local and global values in higher education, since the world-class model is more associated with US model of research university, and reaching high positions in rankings may mean becoming similar to Western higher education institutions to some extent, especially in terms of resources, standards, performance indicators, and even governance patterns. So Taiwan, Japan, and China cases raise important concerns about these aspects. So I'll probably stop here and give the floor to Jamil and some conclusions now. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Very good evening, afternoon, morning to all of you who joined us. As Phil mentioned at the beginning of his words, we have to be very careful and humble in drawing conclusions for two reasons. The first caveat is to recognize that transforming universities is a long process. While these excellence initiatives, in some cases, were a one-shot program that lasted 4 or 5 years, or 2 phases. But we know that from other research that creating a world-class university may take at least 10, 15, not 20 years. So that limits our ability to have final conclusions, except in the case of China, which has been going at this for more than 2 decades, where we can see significant results because there have been a lot of investment, as Phil mentioned, but for the other countries, it's much more difficult. And the second challenge is the issue of attribution. Even if we could do some correlations if we had a large sample of institutions to establish that these excellence initiatives seem to have results, we are not sure 100% that the positive changes are directly linked to the excellence initiative. But this being said, there are quite a few things that come out clearly from these initiatives. First, I want to draw your attention to one dimension of the strategies that governments have adopted. If you think about this concept of world-class universities, there are 3 ways of becoming world-class. One, and that's directly relevant to the Hong Kong case, because we are already today located in Hong Kong for this webinar, is to create a new university from scratch. And even though Hong Kong was not part of the territory of Hong Kong was not part of our study, there is a clear case, the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, No offense meant to our friends from the University of Hong Kong, which is the territory's flagship university. But this is a university that was created from scratch a little bit over 25 years ago, and that became a world-class university, one of the top in the region. The second strategy is to merge universities. And some of the countries in our sample of case studies follow these strategies. Russia did it before the Excellence Initiative. China in the 90s had several hundreds of universities mergers. In Germany, there was one case of merger. And the French initiative is really the one where the government specifically offered incentives to push universities to merge. And in fact, the first three that were recognized as a result of the Excellence Initiative, which was a competitive process, were three universities outside Paris, the capital city, which were the products of mergers, namely Strasbourg, Marseille, and Bordeaux. I wanted to mention that in terms of strategies. Now, what results can we observe? First, as my colleagues mentioned, the rankings were a big, and international visibility were a big factor behind the decision of governments to inject additional resources to push some of their universities. And when we look at the top three performing universities from each of the 9 countries in our book, apart from the great results achieved by China that has already been mentioned, we can see substantial progress only in 2 countries, Denmark and France. And to a certain extent, Malaysia, because the University of Malaya has also risen. However, the position of the German universities has not changed. And in 2 cases, Russia and Japan, overall the universities have, their position has decreased. So this is not conclusive. I would like to mention also something that I call the World-Class University Concentration Index, which is a calculation that I have been doing over the years and which we highlight at the end of the book. This index is defined by the number of universities that any country has in the top 100 in the Shanghai ranking relative to its population, and we use the logarithmic value of the population to compensate for the large variations in population size. If you think, for example, about China versus Denmark. So when you look at this index, you compare 2004 and 2022, which was the last year we had when we finalized the book, we see that on the one hand, 3 big countries have fallen significantly, US, UK, and Japan. 2 countries which were not in our sample have progressed, Australia and Switzerland. And the other dimension that is significant is that we have many more small countries that are in the top 10. And this is a very interesting finding, and I think that applies also to the situation that you experience in Hong Kong, is that you don't need to be a huge, big country. Of course, it has worked well for China, but not necessary for the other big countries. But you have small countries like Finland, Denmark, Switzerland, Israel, Canada, Australia in terms of population, even though they're geographically they are big, that have progressed significantly. But perhaps more importantly is the qualitative assessment that we can make from looking at the case studies. Professor Altbach teased me by mentioning that I had a recipe for success. Maybe he's half right, half in the sense that in a previous work that he and I did together, we observed that there were 3 sets of factors that, taken together, explain the success of world-class universities. And these are concentration of talent, abundant resources, and adequate governance. And if you think about the first one, strengthening talent, this is really what these excellence initiatives have been about. And my colleague, Professor Yudkevich, explains very well that why we chose this title of academic stars, because the universities that received additional funding use that funding to attract, to recruit top researchers or very promising young researchers. And not only from their country, but in many cases from the diaspora, that's typically the case for China, but also for South Korea, Germany, to a certain extent, France, but also sending your own people to do excellence initiative is launched. And I think that's one of the reasons the top 2 universities in Denmark, University of Copenhagen and University of Aarhus, which participated in the Excellence Initiative, have made very significant progress. Since we are talking about governance, I think one important element has to do with leadership. We know that to successfully transform a university, you need to have strong, visionary, inspiring leadership, and the mode of selection of the leaders can be an obstacle or a favorable dimension. Around the world, we have 3 ways of selecting leaders. One is for governments to designate, as is the case in China or Russia. Or the other one is to elect democratically. That is what we see in France and Germany, for example. And that doesn't always produce the best results. And finally, we have a third modality, which is the Anglo-Saxon model, but it's something that Denmark adopted. They used to have elected rectors or university presidents, and they moved to a system of competitive recruitment where, based on professional criteria, where the board of directors of the university drives the process. Another important dimension that is worth mentioning is the issue of academic freedom, which, as you know, if you look at the index of academic freedom, has been under increasing attack all over the world. And the question that we raise in our book is, can you have top universities in countries where there are restrictions on academic freedom? The question is an open one. The jury has not come back yet, but this is an important question to raise. Professor Altbach mentioned the issue of system differentiation. Is it dangerous when resources are concentrated on a small number of universities? How is it likely to affect the other parts of the system? And in many countries, there have been worries that there would be less resources for the university not participating in the Excellence Initiative. The evidence from the case studies is that it is not the case. It's an unfounded worry. And another side or consequence, unintended consequences, is that even universities that didn't receive resources from the Excellence Initiative tried, or some of them tried very hard to improve their performance, to emulate, to do some of the same things that the Excellence Initiative universities were doing. We've seen that in France, in Germany, in China, and my colleagues may come in and mention other examples. Perhaps one last comment to conclude is that, or maybe two. First, we observe that excellence initiatives have changed the landscape in the participating countries for good. I don't think there is turning back. There is a process, focus on the performance of universities, not only within the university community, but in society at large, in the political sphere. And that is a departure from what happened 10, 15 years, 20 years ago in some of the countries. And second is coming back to this issue of the rankings and trying to distance ourselves, recognizing that academic excellence is much more than just rising in the rankings. In the era of fake news, the important role that universities play in defending scientific evidence, defending truth, is one important part of their mission. Promoting equity and inclusion is also very important. Just because you strive to be excellent doesn't mean that you should not be also encouraging talented students from underrepresented groups from participating. And lastly, the social engagement of universities that are committed to these SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And today, when our planet is facing this huge challenge of climate change, this is an area where the research and the training that these universities offer or produce can contribute to the fight against climate change, to the rise of the green and circular economy. So it is very important to think about this definition of academic excellence in a wider way. I will stop at this to allow our participants to ask questions or make comment. Over to you, Hugo.
Thank you so much, Jamil, and definitely a lot of food for thought, very important analysis, not only for policymakers at national level, but also for those who are governing our institutions and institutions of higher education all around the world. I have my own questions. I see that we already have a comment in the chat by Giulio Marini. Giulio, do you want to ask the question yourself, or would you prefer that I would read it?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, perhaps I can speak my own question. Basically, I was asking myself, as a person who is not a specialist about rankings, but inevitably we reflect about rankings and those initiatives. I was asking myself whether a country like China would have anyway some globally leading universities, because it is becoming the country itself a dominant player. And at the same time, a country which is not a dominant one, with all due respect, despite any possible initiative, perhaps would never become much high in rankings. I ask this because, you know, any university will always have a country in the background, and that's perhaps more important than many people devising strategies may admit. Perhaps just a question for you.
Well, if I can start with a few comments, because a very interesting observation. I mean, China is now a major global player in higher education, and I don't know that we have any data on this, but I don't think that without the excellence initiatives in China over the last several decades, this would have occurred. China, of course, had universities prior to the excellence initiatives, had changed governance patterns after the liberation of, well, the Chinese Revolution in 1949 to the Soviet model, and then opened up later to more Western influences. And we could have a long discussion about China, on which I am not an expert. But I think the excellence initiatives were key, and that China, in terms of research output and all kinds of other measures, is now one of the top global players. And that is largely, I think, because of the excellence initiatives and because of different thinking in the China context.
Yes,
Let
Jamil,
me
please.
perhaps come back to the issue of the of funding. It's obviously to hire, to be able to attract top researchers or to invest in expensive scientific infrastructure, you need a lot of resources. So as I mentioned in my observations, it is true that even universities that did not receive funding tried to improve their performance, to adopt some of the same strategies, but having the financial resources will make a difference. And that may be a difficulty in countries where you don't have an excellence initiatives or where the system is not well funded, because as you know, there are countries that are doing very well, like Australia or Switzerland, without having excellence initiative. But because they are well resourced, and in a way, the US and the UK, whose universities are the top in the rankings, have done well because some of their universities are powerhouses, very well funded.
Maria?
Yes, probably just a short comment to what Jamil just said about resources. I think that in addition to resources, what is really important is an external commitment that arises when university joins the program. So many universities consider it as a new the idea of project-based approach to their functioning and performance. And in many cases, including, for example, China, Russia, many others, so universities moved from simple existence as a kind of branch of ministry or something into the firm which has its own mission, resources, goals, and the concept of efficiency became quite new to those institutions after they joined the program. I think that's also was important for getting such results in a fast time.
All right, thank you. I think Phil wants to add a few more words to his
Yes,
initial
if I might, I have two little comments really underlining things that Jamil said, and one question perhaps for the audience. The comments are definitely the academic excellence initiatives focused both governmental and public attention on these initiatives and on higher education, and particularly the research intensive sectors, and maybe a little bit on also rankings in their societies. And I think this was extremely important to sort of bring higher ed into the broader context of debate at the governmental level and at the public level, because there were articles in the newspapers, we still had newspapers in those days, and in the media on what was going on. So that's first point. Second point is also made by the three of us, but I think very important. These initiatives had some impact on the rest of the system, and I think legitimized the idea of a differentiation. That is, there should be at the top research intensive institutions. And this was a big sell in Germany, for example, where the traditional concept was all God's universities are equal, according to von Humboldt, to have a notion that there are some, more research focused and some less research focused. And I think this is true for other countries as well. So I think these are important points. And here's my question, which may be a little bit controversial. This webinar is based in Hong Kong. I don't know the proportion of our audience participants who are in Hong Kong, but what's the future of Hong Kong, which has an extremely successful higher education system? If you look at the rankings, if you look at research output and so on, in the changing, I would say, increasingly negative, socio-political environment in Hong Kong going forward. Can it maintain its excellence and so on? And I think this is a really interesting question. And I know colleagues in Hong Kong are worrying about this issue, both in terms of the broader society and in the smaller context of higher education. So thanks.
That is a question that would take probably a lot of time to be answered. But I guess some of the audience, if they want to give an answer, I think it would be a nice idea if you could write an email to Phil and express your own opinions. I think it would be interesting. I have to move on to other comments from the audience. Jisan Zhang has the next comment. She says that her mic is not working, so I'll read it for you. Thank you for sharing your new book. Our students in higher education have read your chapters with great interest this week, and they just suggested new ranking indicators such as diversity inclusion, students' mental well-being support, social engagement, etc. To extend the concept of world-class universities, can you give comments whether the landscape can be changed with new ranking indicators and include emerging issues?
Well, just a very brief comment to start, and I don't want to monopolize the conversation. I go crazy about the new ranking indicators and new rankings. Too much attention focused on it, and so on. The rankings started, as we all know, to measure research-intensive institutions. And if you look at the universities in the traditional most influential rankings still, Shanghai, QS, and THE, that's what they still do, although they have added other aspects which are hard to measure. No, impossible to measure. So I am not in favor of this brilliant thought from the class. So.
Okay, got it. Yeah, Jamil, yes.
Yeah, I have slightly different opinion than my esteemed colleague and friend, Professor Altbach. Just perhaps a nuance. I think we know the rankers are playing the ranking games, and they need, especially the commercial rankers. So very often when they invent a new ranking, it's to sell something, their services or their publications, and that is not good. I fully agree with Professor Altbach. But for example, I have some sympathy with the Times Higher Education Impact ranking because it has encouraged universities on a voluntary basis to take stock of what they were doing on behalf of the SDGs. And I think that's a good thing. I think looking at equity in access, success, inclusion is also a healthy thing. You could, two excellent universities, you take Harvard on the one hand, #1 in the world, and Berkeley in the top 10. Two world-class universities. But in terms of inclusion, Harvard is very selective, while Berkeley has 30% of students who have federal scholarships, the Pell Grants as they are called in the US, coming from low-income groups. So I think that demonstrates that you can have academic excellence at the same time being more open. You don't have to be crazily selective. So with caution. And the last point is, as Professor Altbach rightly said, these rankings measure research excellence. But some of the excellence initiatives tried also to push for excellence in teaching. It was the case in Taiwan, a little bit in France. But the rankings, first of all, it's very difficult to measure if you make progress. And second, the rankings do not, because it's difficult, the rankings do not perceive. So there is no incentive for university leaders to pay too much attention to these other dimensions.
Right. Okay. Maria?
I just wonder if we do the following exercise. We took people from different universities and asked them, like university leaders, and asked them suggest some indicators into the rankings and to build what might be called academic ranking. I believe that's going to be the most awful thing ever, because what each university would propose, there would be indicator in which this university is particularly good in. So, and I think that that's the problem. The government suggests, some indicators. Government is interested in for-profit ranking agencies. They also suggest what they might be interested into. So the whole idea of academic excellence here takes a secondary role. And I do agree with Phil that everything is constrained by the idea of transparency and the idea of measurement. We put into rankings what could be measured, but not what's the most important for them. And adding extra ranking indicators makes the problem worse, not easier for the community.
All right, thank you very much. Next question is by Alice Lam. Alice, do you want to ask the question yourself? I don't hear from Alice, so maybe she is unable to. So let me read it. Thank you, professors, for your precious time. Professor Jamil mentioned how important the leaders are. For example, recent research on university leadership suggests that in the case of top research universities, the best performing institutions have leaders who combine good managerial skills and a successful research career. What about rapport? The selection of our leaders is not a transparent process, and quite often the leaders are not who academics like, respect, support. What would be the future of such universities?
I'm a firm believer in the importance of leadership. I think this is a very important question that was raised by Alice. And I think there is evidence, many case studies showing that universities that have transformed themselves thoroughly, it was under the influence of a leader who was respected and had a vision. I can think, for two examples, if I may. The Federal Polytechnic of Lausanne in Switzerland. You know, Switzerland has this top. Zurich Polytechnic was the best one, and EPFL was a second-class university. Back then, in the Francophone world, Polytechnic of France would be the flagship engineering school. 20 years later, under the influence of a professor who had experience in the US and who stayed 15 years at the helm of EPFL. EPFL is now the leading Francophone engineering school. And the other example comes from the US, where Arizona State University, under the helm of Professor Michael Crow, has really transformed ourselves. I don't know if Phil would agree or not, but I believe that when you have government appointing leaders, you may have frequent rotation. Comparisons of Singapore and Malaysia have shown that this is one of the plus for Singapore, where you have professional leadership compared to leaders in the case of Malaysia who are sometimes political appointees. Sometimes they are very good, but there is a risk. And when you elect a person, that person makes promises, and his promises are not always favorable to the institution. They go towards status quo, toward maintaining, protecting vested interests. Of course, you have sometimes elected leaders who are very good, but by and large, these two methods are not the best methods if you want really to have enlightened leaders who can transform, who can lead the transformation of the universities. Because one person alone doesn't transform university, but the person who is able to convince and to inspire the entire university community can make a big difference.
And one other point, if I may, they have to last a while. That is, in many countries, the terms of university rectors or presidents is limited and fairly short. And we find from the data that that a transformative leader needs to have time to do his or her work. And this is an interesting lesson in the United States, where the terms of university presidents, I shouldn't say the term, the times in office of university presidents gets shorter and shorter. In the case recently of Harvard, of course, it was like 6 months, but that's a special case. And the pressures on these academic leaders, not in all countries, but in some, are ever greater. But again, we could spend, and probably should, a whole webinar or a whole year studying this important topic.
Absolutely. Maria, I don't know if you want to add up to this comment. No, it's okay. Then we'll move to the next question by Renjie Kai. Do you want to ask the question yourself? Okay. Currently not. So let me read the question for you. Currently, the methodologies and indicators of the 4 major world university rankings are not friendly to higher education institutions with fewer disciplines or with a strong liberal arts and social science focus. Therefore, I am wondering, how should these universities respond to the prevalence of rankings or ranking fetishism? Oh yeah, mentioned that the mic is not working. So we have another question about rankings driving this initiative and how do they do it? Yeah, Maria?
I'll probably start with some comment on the problem of social sciences and humanities in terms of rankings. Of course, those disciplines are very much discriminated because they don't bring too much into rankings. But I do believe that rankings here reflect even bigger problem here, because rankings are about clear division between disciplines. Mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology, everything is separate, measured separately, then bring together. So when we deal with multidisciplinary research, which becomes a key driver for many important researchers in the university, it's really hard to suggest something how we should measure this kind of research and its impact. So if people from different departments produce something really multidisciplinary, they became discriminated heavily because it's really hard to put this kind of results into dimensions of former ranking system. That's what I believe one of the key problems here.
I don't know if Phil or Jamil want to add something to Maria's comment.
Just one point. I think, I fully subscribe with what Maria said, and that's why there is an advantage to comprehensive universities. And if again, coming back to Harvard, #1 in the world, I don't know what would be the balance between STEM programs and social humanities and social science programs, but Harvard and University of Toronto, and you have big comprehensive universities that are very strong in the social science, in spite of the bias of the ranking that Maria rightly pointed to.
Right. We have some questions by LNU, but I believe you already answered them. in responding to others. So I will move to the final question that I have here in the chat by Svetlana. Svetlana, do you want to ask the question yourself? Okay, internet connection is unsustainable. So I'll read it to you as well. My question is in the line of Ali's questions above. For example, some rectors of the 100 universities in Russia have occupied their positions for more than 20 years. Why Academic Excellence Initiative and the advice of academic stars did not change non-democratic university practices at university level? I imagine that this is in the case of Russia. Not sure if this applies to China or some other non-democratic country that you might have in the sample. What would be your reactions to this question?
I
will
would
start with you, Maria.
I would probably comment on the Russian case. So first, that's very important. That's a very important question. And with the start of the program, a lot of power of rectors of those universities was very much constrained by creation of different kind of councils, including international councils that Phil mentioned. Each university was obliged to have one, and the power of rector has been constrained by these bodies sensibly. But after a few years, many rectors of those universities have been actually changed into more young, more energetic people, and quite often people with business experience and government experience. So the idea of introduction of having rectors from inside those institutions, what we might be called rector inbreeding, has been substituted by the idea of rectors appointed by their government. And the key characteristic of the good rectors there for the government was to have a person who is very much under control of the ministry and the government, not necessarily supported by the academic community.
Okay, I don't know if Phil and Jamil want to add something to this issue.
Well, just a very brief comment, focusing a bit on the Russian case. Where you have long-serving leaders coming out of the old Soviet system, at least Soviet way of thinking, and sometimes actual Soviet system, that's a problem. So, you know, longevity in office is not a universal measure of success. Yeah, so, and it depends very much on the national environment.
Yeah, just to add to that, to echo, if you have a tiger or a dragon leading your institution, then yes, you have transformation. If you have a dinosaur, then you're stuck.
Thank you very much. If you don't mind, let me ask you a final question myself. In what way did these initiatives actually contributed with real new knowledge or a substantial kind of contribution to the advancement of science, and rather than what they really contributed was more garbage in, garbage out? That looks amazing, measured by publication and citation metrics. So that would be one question. And my second one, which is somewhat related, but not really the same, what about interdisciplinarity? Did you see a transformation of interdisciplinarity, considering that innovation is becoming increasingly complex, engaging multiple disciplines? Do we see a transformation in these universities that benefited from these schemes, these policies?
Well, my quick answer, and my colleagues would have more details, I think, and that is definitely, you know, we ended up our research feeling, and I also felt this very much about the Russian case that I was a little bit involved with personally, that these were very valuable exercises at all levels. As I said before, focusing attention from government and the public on higher education, interdisciplinarity, definitely, focusing on leadership, definitely, in some countries getting, in the Russian case, I don't know, maybe also in the Chinese case, getting rid of dinosaurs in leadership and so on. So was the money well spent 100%? Maybe not. But as Jamil points out, in most countries, the amounts of money given were, in the broader scheme of things, not that much. And I think the results were really pretty impressive. I'd be very interested to hear what my colleagues have to say.
Yeah, Jamil, please.
I fully agree with Professor Altbach, and I have the privilege of serving on international advisory councils in both Germany and France, and I've seen really positive results. Many of these universities have set up multidisciplinary research centers, research institutes, doing leading edge research, exploring new frontiers. They have more resources, more equipment. They are able to work with colleagues from all over the world through research networks. It has created a new dynamics that didn't exist in some of these countries. So I am very positive, and that's why we have to forget about the rankings and look at specific results that come out of these universities.
Yes, Maria, please.
Yeah, just a little bit to what my colleague just said. I think it's important to stress what we see from almost all cases. We see that those programs give support for training of new generation of human capital in universities. And that's a long-standing and long-term consequences. And those young people trained got a better education, better research support. They got access to academic mobility and research, new research infrastructure, and also to international first-class mentors. And I do believe that's one of the key changes in their system on the national levels in general.
All right, thank you very much. And with this rather positive note and assessment of these initiatives, I think we can close the seminar of today. Thank you very much to the speakers in very completely different time zones. And thank you also to those who asked questions, comments, and participated, and all of you that came to listen to the presentation, but also the discussion that we've had. Having said that, I wish you all a very nice morning, day, or evening, and I hope to see you soon. All right. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.